It should be going.
All right, cool. All right, so we are going to be doing our first group discussion, and we're going to be starting it off with the interesting points or the interesting point that we got from the NATA scavenger hunt. Um, so I will go ahead and share my screen first. Actually, I don't even know if I can. Oh, there we go. Sweet. Okay, never mind. I can't. You can disable screen sharing.
What happened?
It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
It should all be on.
Oh, here we go. Here we go. Yeah. Okay, cool.
Okay.
All right. So this was the interesting point I'm gonna be talking about. I really liked how they had the AT Cares program because I know we can do or we can see some pretty serious stuff and it can really take a toll on us mentally. And it's just really nice to know that they have a program put in place to where if we do need people to talk with and go over stuff with to talk about the stuff we've seen, it's just nice to know that we've got kind of like that backup and that support system behind us to talk about that with someone with if we need to, because we can definitely see some pretty crazy stuff that can leave a toll on us mentally. So it's just nice to know that they have the AT Cares program, and it was nice to read up on that and see all the stuff they're doing with that and all the other interesting stuff about it.
Um, I like that too. I feel like they would have used that a lot also during like COVID and stuff.
Especially during COVID, yeah.
Okay. Mine, I didn't feel like copy and pasting it anywhere. So it's basically this. Whenever we did the infographic, I basically went back to the homepage on NATA and found one about apparently there's a NATA podcast. And so you can go and it's basically a bunch
Mhm.
of ATs that work together and they like talk about different topics that are important to athletic trainers. So like the few that like I listened to parts of was called Compensation Conversation, which basically is a task force that NATA created to investigate basically like why athletic trainers get compensated the way that they do. And I feel like first of all, I didn't even know that that was a thing, the compensation task force or whatever. But obviously,
Yeah.
like it's important, especially because like we're already kind of misunderstood as a profession and we're growing. And so I think it's important to have that group of people that's like actually looking into why we're getting paid the way we are and like how to improve it and stuff.
Yeah, because I hear it's definitely probably a little underpaid for how much we actually know and how much we actually do.
Yeah.
It would be nice. It's nice knowing that they're actually trying to get the word out and let them know, like, hey, like we're actually pretty cool and like we actually know a lot of stuff and we're very well
Yeah.
trained. All right, and then now we will go on to our NATA position statement that we looked over. So I will go ahead and start sharing again. All right, cool. So the one I picked was the statement over preventing sudden death in sports. And I just thought this would be a cool one to look over because obviously with the Damar Hamlin incident that happened not too long ago, it was a very highly talked about topic and it really put the ATs in the light. And it's just very nice to kind of look over all their different procedures and protocols for some of the more, as you can see, they have like asthma, catastrophic brain injury, cervical spine, diabetes, like heat stroke, hyponatremia. So they've got some of like the bigger ones on here. And pretty much they were just going over and talking a little bit about what each disease was or which one or what each of them were, and then their recommendations on how to see signs of them and how to recognize when one of them were happening. And then also they were giving their recommendations on what to do and to how to properly treat it and care for them until we can get them to emergency services, as in like to the hospital to actually see a physician. And the two recommendations I'm going to be going over were for the catastrophic brain injury, and it was just some are the recommendations for actually preventing it. So their number one was that we need to be responsible for coordinating educational sessions with athletes and coaches to make sure that they're wearing the proper, oh wait, sorry. And then they need for proper signs and symptom recognition of concussion, which is a big one because I know a lot of coaches are terrible at that and they tend to just try and bypass it at every means possible and actually don't tend to care about it as much because they just want their players to play and they need to be better at recognizing signs and symptoms because I know they probably grew up differently and they were never really worried about stuff like that. So it's just very important that they can recognize and then that people report them to their coaches when they're having these kind of symptoms. And then the other one was that we need to make sure that we are enforcing and they also have the proper certified helmets and that we need to educate the athletes and coaches on that and especially parents too because they might be the ones buying them, especially for like little league or as they grow up through like select sports and whatnot like that. But yeah, that's very big in preventing catastrophic brain injuries or head injuries or concussions or anything like that. But as you can see here, they do not prevent cerebral concussions, but just the equipment and making sure they're educated and they know exactly what they need to do or what they need to be looking out for is just very important for stopping and helping prevent these more serious brain injury stuff.
I honestly didn't even see that portion. I kind of like found two that I liked at the beginning on the NATA website, and I was like, oh, okay, that
Oh,
sounds
really?
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I found like a huge list of them. They had like a ton. And I was just
yeah.
like, oh, that sounds interesting to read about.
The portion that I chose was about detecting, preventing, and managing disordered eating in athletes because I feel like that's very big, especially like one in general, but also like high school and college, especially. Um, and I feel like it's just not. I guess personally, I don't think I know enough about it to like be comfortable necessarily like going into a situation like that unless I absolutely had to. So just like before I go into like the points, I guess, about the recommendations that they brought up, because like the recommendations start here and it literally is basically the entire rest of the document. So there was a lot of recommendations on like how to go about educating and like forming different groups that can help like mention it to people or like keep an eye out for it and like what signs and symptoms to look for. But also like every like few pages, there's like a big section like this and like this that just have like different things to like you don't necessarily have to go out of your way to do the research. It's all right here because there's like um the behavioral characteristics. Some of it's about specifically bulimia, some of it's specifically about anorexia, like mental disorders. There's just like different little portions of it that are there. But then under the recommendations, the two important notes that I wanted to make were one, the signs and symptoms, because I didn't realize there were so many physiological symptoms. But apparently, some of the symptoms include bradycardia, which obviously is like slow heart rate, hypotension, and then changes in your pulse of greater than 20 beats per minute can indicate disordered eating, hypothermia, and then also regular changes in your blood pressure of like 10, of greater than 10. And then obviously, like we all know about amenorrhea, which obviously is women not having their periods anymore. And one thing to note is that like women's periods can be very irregular. So it's important to educate that like if this persists for about 3 months, then that's typically when it should start being evaluated because that's not regular. Irregularity is one thing, but like 3 months without it is another thing. And then the second thing that I don't think I thought about, I guess, I mean, I'm not an athletic trainer yet, but like one thing I just didn't think about is to pay more attention to like lean muscle mass and BMI versus using scale weight when evaluating people. One, because of the way that disordered eating works and how it changes your body. But also because scale weight is going to be harder for some people to look at, especially if they have disordered eating because they're worried about the scale weight. So if we use lean muscle mass and BMI, we can explain it differently to them than when you're just weighing somebody's in general. I feel like it's easier for them to compare when it's a weight versus a BMI or a lean muscle mass or anything else like that.
Yeah, cool. So now we're going to go on to the 2 points from the social determinants article. So I will pull mine up now. All right, so I went down into they were both in the 3 section, and the first one was disparities in life expectancy. So life expectancy of birth has increased significantly, but there's still a gap between the white and black life expectancies. So this was going through the total life expectancies of and comparing it between all the different ethnicities and seeing if how much of a difference there was between all of them, and seeing if there was one that was not, or that was actually a lot lower than another. And especially looking from rural areas, and then those compared to people in large metro areas. And people in rural areas are actually having a lower life expectancy from about 74 years compared to people living in large metro areas who have an average closer to 77.6 or even rounded up to 78. So there's definitely a difference there. And then the takeaway I got from that whole section was that there's a noticeable difference in life expectancies for people located in different areas, and also people of different races. And as you can see here, the lowest was being African American males at 72.3 years, and then the highest from the Asian Pacific Islander males being almost to 90 years, which is a crazy difference. And I know it's not completely due to where all they're living, because I know some just have better genetics and they've just eat better and whatnot, but that's pretty crazy difference. And I think that's something that needs to be looked at. And because I don't think that's okay. That's a pretty, because if it was like a year difference, it's like whatever, but it's like that is literally 17 years, which is crazy that some people have that much of a life expectancy. And then the next one I went over was comparing infant mortality rates. And that was the next section after that, 3.3. And so over, we can see here the disparity between the two, or the actual like mortality rates, they decreased a lot between black and white infants, but the actual disparity between the two has increased, which is a little bit alarming to look at. So like the actual like total number of them have gone down a lot, but there's actually a bigger rate now. So for Black babies, it was 11.4 deaths per 1,000. And compared to whites, it was a 4.9 deaths per 1,000, which is a pretty significant difference. And a lot of that has to do with, it was going over some of the conditions and whatnot. The first one was asthma, which is actually the most common condition in children. 13% of children are reporting to have asthma. And it also just has to do with a lot of different factors like poverty level or housing situation, climate, where they're living, if they're how much money their parents make, what schools they're going to. But yeah, that's also a very big difference in mortality rates, and something that needs to be looked at, because I don't think we can just kind of glance past that. That's quite a big difference there. And then the takeaway I got from that section was, while the rates of the infant children are now dying has decreased significantly, there's still that big disparity that I was talking about. And that shouldn't be like that. So we need to make sure we're doing a better job and making sure every baby's got the same chance. I don't think it should depend on race or what situation they're in. We just got to do a better job at kind of evening it out and making sure everyone's got the fair shot at life that they deserve. So those were my 2 points.
I actually looked at the infant mortality rate also.
Oh, cool.
I'm gonna figure out which screen it was. Okay. Yeah, so I mean basically like you said, it decreased from 1935 to 2015, but the difference, the disparity that you mentioned increased. So back in 1935, it was like a 1.9 times higher from the white infant mortality rate to the black infant mortality rate. And then in 2015, it was actually 2.3 times higher between the white and the black infant mortality rate. Um, and then one thing I wish they would have mentioned is like why, because like I know it's genetic, or I know it can be caused by genetic, but is it just genetic, or is it because like we're treating them differently, or what? Because I feel like, especially with infants, like a baby's a baby, like they haven't done
Yeah.
anything, so I feel like
Like
you
they
should
just
help
started
them.
out, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like you should help them anyways. So that, like you said, was really interesting to see because I want to know like why it got higher. Like I appreciate the facts and stuff, but I mean, maybe I just need to do more research and figure it out. And then I mean, you basically touched on everything else. I did notice that for the childhood asthma in like with the infant mortality rate below the poverty line was 56% more likely to get it than families that are 400% above the poverty line. So that was crazy because they're over half as times more likely just because they're like poor.
Yeah, which sucks. Like that's
Yeah.
that's not okay.
Like you didn't even have a choice on that either.
Yeah.
And then the other one that I looked into was disparities in the major chronic conditions and risk factors. I took a lot of notes on it, but I won't go over the whole thing. One thing was like the heart disease diagnosis, which was interesting to see how like the whites weren't necessarily on top, like race wise, because the Asians are 36% less likely to have the prevalence of a heart disease. Um, but then the AIANS, which I'm of course blanking on what they are now, what that stood for.
I also am. I don't remember.
It's like repeated a bunch of times. The American Indians and Alaskan Natives, they
Yeah, yeah.
were 21% more likely than whites. So I guess we like fall in the middle of everything, which was interesting to see because normally I feel like everybody thinks that like race wise, like we're the healthiest or we're the richest or like whatever the case
Which
may
is like
be.
what you'd expect just based
Yeah.
on, yeah.
And then for diabetes, it's kind of the same thing. So the American Indians and Alaskan Natives had a 20.9% prevalence in their race as like a whole, which is actually the greatest of all racial or ethnic groups that are not white. So in this case, the whites were the lowest prevalence of 8.1%, but then for some reason still the American Indians and Alaskan Natives are still the greatest. And so again, it's cool to see the numbers, but I wish it would tell us like why, because it's like, is it just because maybe they're more natural so they don't use as much like American medicine as like other races do, or like is it because of where they live or like how they live? Like that'd be really cool to look into. So
Hmm.
yeah, that's what I found.
Cool. Yeah. Well, that is all the topics. So you're gonna wrap this up and finish off the first group assignment.
Yeah.